And so, once again, I am Romana Diana Castillo, your online learning coordinator for today's philosophy class. And so, our topic for today is all about a German philosopher named Martin Heidegger. So, yes, Martin Heidegger is a German philosopher who was born actually at the late 19th century. But then he was also able to uh, affect the 20th century philosophy. He was just a kid during 19th century anyway. Okay, so let's talk about Martin Heidegger. So who is Martin Heidegger then? Martin Heidegger, he was born on 1889. Sadly, though, he passed away on 1976. He was a German philosopher whose work is perhaps most readily associated with phenomenology and existentialism. Okay? So once again, when we say existentialism, it is a philosophical theory or approach which emphasizes the existence of the individual person as free and responsible agent determining their own development through acts of the will. Then phenomenology, it is an approach that concentrates on the study of consciousness and objects of direct experience. So let's continue. So once again, this work is perhaps most readily associated with phenomenology and existentialism, although his thinking should be identified as part of such philosophical movements only with extreme care and qualification. His ideas have exerted a seminal influence on the development of contemporary European philosophy. They have also had an impact far beyond philosophy, for example, in architectural theory, literary criticism, theology, psychotherapy, and cognitive science. And early life and education. So Heidegger grew up in a Catholic family and initially studied theology at the University of Freiburg. Anyway, Heidegger is not that religious, but then since he grew up in a Catholic family, his philosophy was still affected by how he was raised. Since his parents are faithful. However, his interest shifted to philosophy, and he began studying under the prominent philosopher Edmund Husserl. So, who is Edmund Husserl? He was an Austrian German philosopher and mathematician who established the school of phenomenology. In his early work, he elaborated critiques of historicism and of psychologism and logic based on analysis of intentionality. Now, biographical sketch. Martin Heidegger was born in Maastricht, Germany on September 26, 1889. Maastricht was then a quiet, conservative, religious rural town, and as such was a formative influence on Heidegger and his philosophical thought. In 1909, he spent 2 weeks in the Jesuit order before leaving, probably on health grounds, to study theology at the University of Freiburg. In 1911, he switched subjects to philosophy. He began teaching at Freiburg in 1915. So, once again, Heidegger was born on September 26, 1889 in Germany, the son of Johanna Kempf and Friedrich Heidegger. His father was a sexton of the village church, and the young Martin was raised Catholic. When we say sexton, it is an official of a church who takes care of church buildings and property. Then in 1903, Heidegger began to train for the priesthood. He entered a Jesuit seminary in 1909, but was discharged within weeks because of heart trouble. It was during this time that he first encountered the work of Franz Brentano on the various meanings of being according to Aristotle. As that means Heidegger was also pretty much influenced by our classical philosophers. Once again, Aristotle is a part of our classical Greek philosophers. So from here, he went on to study theology and scholastic philosophy at the University of Freiburg. And so in 1911, he broke off training for the priesthood and turned his attention to recent philosophy, in particular Edmund Husserl's logical investigations. He graduated in with a thesis on psychologism, the doctrine of judgment in psychologism, a critical theoretical contribution to logic in 1914. The following year, he completed his habilitation thesis on Nuns Scotus, which was directed by Heinrich Rickert, a neo-Kantian, and influenced by Husserl's phenomenology. So he attempted to get a Catholic philosophy post at the University of Freiburg on 23rd June 1916, but failed despite the support of Heinrich Fink. Instead, he worked first as an unsalaried private docent or an assistant professor, then served as a soldier during the final year of World War I. His service was in the last 10 months of the war, most of which he spent in meteorological unit on the Western Front upon being deemed unfit for combat. Now, let's talk about his wife. So, Alfred P. Heidegger is Martin Heidegger's wife. So, in 1917, he married Alfred Petri, with whom he had two sons, Georg and Hermann, and from whom he never parted. Although his affair with the philosopher Hannah Arendt, his student at Marburg in 1920s, is well known. Heidegger married Alfred Petri on March 21, 1917, in a Catholic ceremony officiated by his friend Engelbert Krebs, and a week later in a Protestant ceremony in presence of her parents. Their first son, Jörg, was born in 1919. Alfred then gave birth to Hermann in August 1920. Heidegger knew that he was not Hermann's biological father, but raised him as his son. Hermann's biological father, who became godfather to his son, was a family friend and Dr. Friedel Cesar. Hermann was told of peace at the age of 14. Hermann grew up to become a historian and would later serve as the executor of Heidegger's will. Then, phenomenology and academic career. So, Heidegger's early work was heavily influenced by phenomenology, particularly the phenomenology of Husserl. His major work, Being and Time, so in German, it is read Sein and Zit. So this was published in 1927, it is considered one of the most significant philosophical works of the 20th century. In Being and Time, Heidegger explored the question of the meaning of being, drawing on existentialist themes and emphasizing the concept of Dasein, or being there, as a way to understand human existence. Now let's talk about Being and Time. The book is likened to a secularized version of Martin Luther's project, which aimed to turn Christian theology back to an earlier and more original faith. Taking this view, John D. Caputo notes that Heidegger made systematic study of Luther in the 1920s after training for 10 years as a Catholic theologian. Similarly, Hubert Dreyfus likens Division 2 of the volume to a secularized version of Kierkegaard's Christianity. Almost all central concepts of being and time are derived from Augustine, Luther, and Kierkegaard according to Christian laws. Anyway, Kierkegaard's philosophy and writings focused on the concepts of free will, self expression, and the human experience. And Kierkegaard was a Danish theologian, philosopher, poet, social critic, and religious author who is widely considered to be the first existentialist philosopher. And Being and Time, the text and its prehistory, Being and Time is a long and complex book. The reader is immediately struck by what Mulhall calls the tortured intensity of Heidegger's prose. Although if the text is read in its original German, it is possible to hear the vast number of what appear to be neologisms as attempts to reanimate the German language. According to this latter gloss, the linguistic constructions concerned, which involve hyphenations, unusual prefixes, and uncommon suffixes, reveal the hidden meanings and resonances of ordinary talk. So, yes, sometimes when texts are actually translated, some parts of it are actually lost. And so somehow when we are studying philosophy, it's all right to actually learn the language, its original language, especially if the philosophy is not written originally in English. Okay, so let's continue. And so in any case, for many readers, The initial, the initially strange and difficult language of being and time is fully vindicated by the realization that Heidegger is struggling to say things for which our conventional terms and linguistic constructions are ultimately inadequate. Indeed, for some thinkers who have toiled in its wake, Heidegger's language becomes the language of philosophy. Viewed from the perspective of Heidegger's own intentions, the work is incomplete. It was meant to have two parts, each of which was supposed to be divided into three divisions. So, Being and Time is the 1927 magnum opus of German philosopher Martin Heidegger and a key document of existentialism. Being and Time had a notable impact on subsequent philosophy, literary theory, and many other fields. Though controversial, its stature in intellectual history has been compared with works by Kant and Hegel. The book attempts to revive ontology through an analysis of Dasein or being in the world. It is also noted for an array of neologisms and complex language, as well as an extended treatment of authenticity as a means to grasp and confront the unique and finite possibilities of the individual. So when we say ontology, so it's a form of metaphysics dealing with the nature of being. So that's ontology. So let's continue. And so, in terms of structure, being and time consists of the lengthy two-part introduction, followed by Division 1, the preparatory fundamental analysis of the sign, and Division 2, the sign and temporality. Heidegger originally planned to write a separate second volume, but quickly abandoned the project. The unwritten second half was to include a critic of Western philosophy. So, Dasein, being and time, explicitly rejects Descartes' notion of the human being as a subjective spectator of objects, according to Marcella Horrigan Kelly. The book instead holds that both subject and object are inseparable. In presenting the term, in presenting the subject being as inseparable from the objective world, Heidegger introduced the term Dasein, or literally being there, intended to embody a living being. Through their activity of being there and being in the world, understood as a unitary phenomenon rather than a contingent additive combination, being in the world is an essential characteristic of Dasein, according to Michael Wheeler. Heidegger's account of Dasein passes through an analysis of angst, the nothing, and mortality, and of the structure of care as such. He then defines authenticity as a means to grasp and confront the finite possibilities of Dasein. Moreover, Dasein is the being that will give access to the question of the meaning of being, according to Heidegger. So, being, the word claims that ordinary and even mundane being in the world provides access to the meaning or sense of being. In German, Sinn that's science, this access via Dasein is also that in terms of which something becomes intelligible as something. This meaning would then elucidate ordinary pre-scientific understanding, which precedes abstract ways of knowing, such as logic or theory. Heidegger's concept of being is metaphorical, according to Richard Rorty, who agrees with Heidegger that there is no hidden power called being. Heidegger emphasizes that no particular understanding of being is to be valued over another, according to an account of Rorty's analysis by Edward Grip. The supposed non-linguistic pre-cognitive access to the meaning of being didn't underscore any particular preferred narrative. Okay? So, for Thomas Sheehan and Mark Rathel, each separately assert that commentators' emphasis on the term being is misplaced and that Heidegger's central focus was never on being as such. Rathel wrote that Heidegger's elaborate concept of unconcealment was his central lifelong focus, while Sheehan proposed that the philosopher's prime focus was on that which brings about being as a givenness of entities. Being and time actually offers no sense of how we might answer the question of being as such, writes Simon Critchley in a 9-part blog commentary on the work for The Guardian. The book instead provides an answer to the question of what it means to be human. Nonetheless, Heidegger does present the concept being is not something like a being, but is rather what determines beings as beings. Now, time. Heidegger believes that time finds its meaning in death, according to Michael Kelly. That is, time is understood only from a finite or mortal vantage. Daseins' fundamental characteristic and mood of being in the world is temporal. Having been thrown into a world implies a pastness in its being. The present is a nodal moment which makes past and future intelligible, writes Lillian Always. Dasein occupies itself with the present tasks required by goals it has projected on the future. So Dasein, as an intertwined subject or object, cannot be separated from its objective historicality, a concept Heidegger credits in the text. Quote, Wilhelm Dilthey, Dasein is stretched along temporally between birth and death and thrown into its world, into its future possibilities, which Dasein is charged with assuming. Dasein's access to this world and these possibilities is always via a history and a tradition or world historicality. Now, let's go back to his life. So Heidegger was also affiliated with German Nazi before. So in 1933, Heidegger joined the Nazi Party and was elected rector of Freiburg University, where, depending on whose account one believes, he either enthusiastically implemented the Nazi policy of bringing university education into line with Hitler's nauseating political program, or he allowed that policy to be officially implemented while conducting a partially underground campaign of resistance to some of its details, especially its anti Semitism. During the short period of his rectorship, he resigned in 1934. Heidegger gave a number of public speeches in which Nazi images, plus occasional declarations of support for Hitler, are integrated with philosophical language of being and time. After 1934, Heidegger became increasingly distanced from Nazi politics. Although he didn't leave the Nazi party, he did attract some unwelcome attention from its enthusiasts. After the war, however, a university denazification committee at Freiburg investigated Heidegger and banned him from teaching, a right which he did not get back until 1949. 1 year later, he was made professor emeritus. Against this background of contrary information, one will search in vain through Heidegger's later writings for the sort of total and unambiguous repudiation of National Socialism that one might hope to find. Then post-war period and later work. After World War II, Heidegger faced denazification measures but was eventually allowed to resume his academic career. He continued to publish influential works, including The Question Concerning Technology and Building Dwelling Thinking. Heidegger's later philosophy turned more towards issues of language, poetry, and technology. He explored the impact of modern technology on the way humans understand themselves and the world. Then later works, The Turn, Heidegger's Turn, which is sometimes referred to by the German Die Kehr, refers to a change in his work as early as 1930 that became clearly established by the 1940s. According to some commentators who variously describe a shift of focus or a major change in outlook. Heidegger himself frequently used the term to refer to the shift announced at the end of being and time from being and time into time being. However, he rejected the existence of the sharp about term posited by some interpreters. Scholar Michael Inwood also calls attention to the fact that many of the ideas from being and time are retained in a different vocabulary in his later work, and also that in other cases, a word or expression common throughout his career comes to acquire a different meaning in the later works. So, legacy, Heidegger's impact on philosophy extends beyond his direct followers and has influenced various fields, including existentialism, hermeneutics, and postmodern thought. So, once again, what is hermeneutics? Hermeneutics is a branch of knowledge that deals with the interpretation, especially of the Bible or literary texts. So let's continue. Despite the controversies surrounding his political affiliations, since he was affiliated with the German Nazi before, during the war, Heidegger's works continue to be studied and debated, and he is recognized as a key figure in the 20th century philosophy. The reception, early criticisms, according to Husserl, Being and Time, claim to deal with ontology, but only did so in the first few pages of the book. Having nothing further to contribute to an ontology independent of human existence, Heidegger changed the topic to Dasein, whereas Heidegger argued that the question of human existence is central to the pursuit of the question of being. Husserl criticized these as reducing phenomenology to philosophical anthropology and offering an abstract and incorrect portrait of the human being. Then European reception. Heidegger is often considered to be among the most important and influential philosophers of the 20th century by many observers. Aspects of his work, however, have been criticized by those who nevertheless acknowledge this influence. Some questions raised about Heidegger's philosophy include the priority of ontology, the status of animals, the nature of the religious, Heidegger's supposed neglect of ethics, the body, sexual difference, and space. Then, Hegelian Marxist thinkers, especially Georgi Lukács and Frankfurt School, associated the style and content of Heidegger's thought with irrationalism and criticized its political implications. For instance, Theodor Adorno wrote an extended critique of the ideological character of Heidegger's early and later use of language in the jargon of authenticity, and Jürgen Habermas acknowledges the influence of Heidegger on recent French philosophy in his polemic against postmodernism in the philosophical discourse of modernity. So in France, there is a very long and particular history of reading and interpreting Heidegger's work, because Heidegger's discussion of ontology is sometimes interpreted as rooted in an analysis of the mode of existence of individual human beings, or Dasein. His work has often been associated with existentialism. The influence of Heidegger's on Sartre's 1943 Being and Nothingness is marked. Heidegger himself, however, argued that Sartre had misread his work. So according to Derrida, deconstruction is a tradition inherited via Heidegger. The French term deconstruction is a term coined to translate Heidegger's use of the words destruction, literally destruction, and Abbau, more literally, the building. In addition to these philosophical matters, the major issue of Heidegger's participation in the Nazi Party has always loomed especially large in Europe. And reception by analytic and Anglo-American philosophy, the reception of Heidegger's philosophy by Anglo-American analytic philosophy, beginning with the logical positivists, was almost uniformly negative. Rudolf Carnap accused Heidegger of offering an illusory ontology, criticizing him for committing the fallacy of reification and for wrongly dismissing the logical treatment of language, which, according to Carnap, can only lead to writing nonsensical pseudo propositions. A.J. Ayer objected that Heidegger proposed vast, overarching theories regarding existence that were completely unverifiable through empirical demonstration and logical analysis. So Bertrand Russell considered Heidegger an obscurantist or someone who deliberately presents the facts or full details of something from becoming known. I think highly eccentric in its terminology, his philosophy is extremely obscure. One cannot help suspecting that language is here running riot. An interesting point in his speculations is the insistence that nothingness is something positive. As with much else in existentialism, this is a psychological observation made to pass for logic. So, according to Richard Holt, this quote expresses the sentiments of many 20th century analytic philosophers concerning Heidegger. So Hubert Dreyfus introduced Heidegger's notion of being in the world to research in artificial intelligence. According to Dreyfus, long-standing research questions, such as the frame problem, can be only dissolved within a Heideggerian framework. Heidegger also profoundly influenced enactivism and situated robotics. So enactivism actually means enactivism is a position in cognitive science that argues that cognition arises through a dynamic interaction between an acting organism and its environment. It claims that the environment of an organism is brought about or enacted by the active exercise of that organism's sensory motor processes. And situated robotics, in artificial intelligence and cognitive science, the term situated refers to an agent who is embedded in an environment. And East Asian thought, some writers on Heidegger's work see possibilities within it for dialogue with traditions of thought outside of Western philosophy, particularly East Asian thinking. Despite perceived differences between Eastern and Western philosophy, some of Heidegger's later work, particularly a dialogue on language between a Japanese and an inquirer, does show an interest in initiating such a dialogue. Heidegger himself had contact with a number of leading Japanese intellectuals, including members of Kyoto School, notably Hajime Tanabe and Kuki Shizo. The scholar Shang Chung Yuan stated Heidegger is the only Western philosopher who not only intellectually understands Tao, but has intuitively experienced a sense of it as well. Philosopher Reinhard Ming sees great influence of Taoism and Japanese scholars in Heidegger's work. although this influence is not acknowledged by the author. He asserts it can be shown that Heidegger sometimes appropriated wholesale and almost verbatim major ideas from the German translations of Taoist and Zen Buddhist classics. This, he adds, this clandestine textual appropriation of non-Western spirituality, that's the extent of which has gone undiscovered for so long, seems quite unparalleled, with far-reaching implications for our future interpretation of Heidegger's work. Sadly, though, he passed away on May 26, 1976, in Freiburg, Germany. And so his philosophical ideas have left a lasting mark on the intellectual landscape and continue to be subjects of study and interpretation. So, as we end our presentation for today, I'm going to end this with this quote by Martin Heidegger himself. If I take that into my life, acknowledge it and face it firmly, and I will free myself from the anxiety of death and pettiness of life, and only then will I be free to become myself. So that's a quote by Martin Heidegger himself. So thank you. So we are not yet done talking about Martin Heidegger.